So this is a webinar for biology, lesson 2, specifically chapter 7 in the textbook. And this is going to be a presentation about that lesson. There's going to be questions in here that are just for practice. They're not going to be graded. So if you're watching this live, participate in all the questions. If you're watching a recording later, pause it and kind of use that to check yourself and make sure that you are understanding the lesson. You can go back and rewatch the slides where I talked about it. And anytime that you do have questions when you're asking them live, if you're watching it live, you can type in the question section, and if you're watching a recording, at the end we'll show you how to get in contact with your instructor if you're not really sure. So let's get started. So chapter 7 is all about cell structure and function. Cells are considered the basic unit of life. So what does that mean? Well, the smallest living organisms are one cell. These include organisms called protists, which is kind of just a category of one-celled organisms. There are a big variety of them. And bacteria. Bacteria are living things, and they're one cell. And then you've also got bigger organisms that are made up of many cells. So all living things are made up of cells. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a slide of cells from an onion plant. So it's just all of the cells that are making up that plant. All living things. So what does a cell do? Well, each cell does a lot of functions. Cells are separated from each other, from other cells, and from their environment by a layer called the cell membrane. But even when they're all together, like in this onion slide here, all of the cells will do certain functions. Okay, so each individual cell can grow, reproduce, take in nutrients and get rid of wastes, and respond to its environment. And these are all the activities that define living things. They're all the activities that are required to be considered a living thing. So an individual cell can be considered a living thing. And cells have smaller parts inside of them, but none of those parts of the cell can do all of these things. Each part's specialized, it can do one or two things. So that's why cells are considered the smallest structures that are considered living, and why cells are the basic unit of life. So that's the smallest living thing, and then you can make bigger organisms by piling together lots and lots and lots of cells. So this brings us to the concept of cell theory. So this is what we accept to be true about cells, and it's basically made up of these three statements. Cell theory states that all living things are made of cells, or of one cell. New cells come from existing cells when they reproduce, as in this image of one cell dividing into two. So cells don't come from non-living parts, they only come from other cells. And cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things, as we just went over on the previous slide. So those three statements combined are what we call cell theory. That's our beliefs about cells, backed up by lots and lots of evidence. There are two basic types of cells. So prokaryotes are cells that have no nucleus, and the only prokaryotes in the world today are bacteria. Their DNA is not stored in a special compartment, it's just bunched up in one area of the cell. And they also have less organelles than other cells compared to these other ones. So all the other cells besides bacteria are eukaryotes. So the word is prokaryote and eukaryote. Eukaryotes have a nucleus that holds the DNA. Okay, so that's going to be right here. It's going to be the biggest, darkest part of the cells. And their DNA is in the nucleus. And then they also have more other organelles than prokaryotes. There's more other parts floating around here doing different jobs. Okay, they're a little bit more complex. And here's some actual microscopic images. You can see in these images that the prokaryote Over here, a bacteria doesn't have a nucleus. So it's just kind of evenly the same color throughout the whole thing. But these eukaryotic cells, which are from an onion, they do. So each one has a dark spot here, and that's the nucleus. These onion cells were dyed so that the nucleus and the cell walls would be visible. Cells are often given false colors so that the different parts are easy to see. And a great example is just this picture that we saw of already of one cell dividing into two cells. So it's not really those colors, but they use dyes and imaging to make different parts of the cell have different colors so that we can see what's going on. Okay, so we're already done with section 1 and ready for our first review question. So let me bring that up as a poll so that you can answer it. There we go. So which of these statements is not a part of cell theory? Is it that all living things are made up of many cells? New cells come from existing cells when they reproduce? Or cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things? Okay, so I do need you to participate. Click one of these answers so that we can move on. You can think about it, but we're going to need to get an answer. Okay, so looks like the answers we got were that new cells come from existing cells when they reproduce. That is actually part of cell theory. So cells don't come from other non-living things. They only come from cells that already exist. And our answer would actually be this one is not a part of cell theory. All living things are made of many cells. So it's a little bit tricky because cell theory does say that all living things are made of cells. But it could be one cell, like a bacteria is only one single cell, or it could be billions of cells, like a human being. We're made of billions and trillions of cells. Um, so it was a little bit of a trick, so sorry about that. But that one is not. The second one is definitely cell theory, and the third one is also definitely part of cell theory. And we have one more review question here. And I won't put this one up as a poll, I'll just bring up the question. All prokaryotes and all eukaryotes what? Which one of these is actually true of all of them? So do they all have a cell wall? Do they all have DNA? Or do they all have a nucleus? So, all prokaryotes and all eukaryotes. We didn't really talk about cell walls yet. We did talk about that the definition of them is prokaryotes don't have a nucleus and eukaryotes do, so it can't be the third one, but have a DNA. They do all have DNA. So every cell has DNA that allows it to reproduce and allows it to uh, do the functions that it does. We'll see how that's all controlled by DNA. And prokaryotes and eukaryotes both have DNA. The difference is that eukaryotes store that DNA in a nucleus and prokaryotes do not. Okay, so let's move on to section 2 about the parts of the cell. So cells are organized in this way. They have a cell membrane that holds everything in. Inside of that is cytoplasm, which is kind of a goop that all of the cell parts float in. The parts of the cell are called organelles. The most important organelle in a eukaryotic cell is the nucleus. This is where the DNA is stored and read, and so it's the command center for the entire cell. And then out in the cytoplasm are other organelles, each with a specific function, and we're going to review all of those now. So first of all, in a eukaryotic cell, the nucleus gives the directions to the rest of the cell, and like we said, it contains the cell's DNA. The DNA contains the codes that make proteins, and that's what keeps the cell running. Prokaryotes, you might be wondering, well, they have DNA, so why don't they have a nucleus? Their DNA just sort of floats in the cytoplasm instead of in the nucleus. The main part of it is densely packed together in a bunch, and it's called the nucleoid. And then there are also plasmids, which are smaller bits of DNA that are scattered around the cell. And all cells have a cell membrane. The cell membrane is made up of two layers of lipids, so it's called a lipid bilayer. The membrane keeps everything contained, it makes the cell waterproof, and it controls what enters and leaves the cell. So the cell membrane has protein channels and protein pumps. So it's going to be all these blue things on this diagram that you see that go all the way across the cell membrane, here and here and here. They're all just embedded into this lipid bilayer and they cross it. And these transport molecules in and out of the cell. So we'll learn a lot more about those in section 3. A cell wall is a layer outside of the cell membrane that adds extra strength. So not all cells have cell walls. Animal cells do not have cell walls. Your cells do not have cell walls, but plant cells do, and prokaryotic cells do. Remember, prokaryotes are bacteria, so most of those have cell walls, and plant cells have cell walls. So you can see them here. Again, this picture of onion cells, they're very clearly divided by these heavy blue lines. Those are the cell walls around the edges. Organelles called vesicles and vacuoles. Both of these are sacs that are made of the same type of membrane as the cell membrane. Vacuoles are for storage. So plant cells have large vacuoles that store water. So that's this here, this big blue area, this plant cell. Vesicles are used as shipping containers. They can attach to the cell membrane to take in and release molecules and then kind of move them across the cell to somewhere else. Another organelle is called a lysosome. Lysosomes are for breaking things down. They're full of enzymes. Lysosomes clean up broken bits of other organelles and then remove them. They also break down large lipids, sugars, and proteins into smaller parts that the other organelles can use. And the cytoskeleton is the support system for the cell. It keeps the cell from collapsing. The cytoskeleton has some other interesting functions. It can kind of move the materials between parts of the cell, and some protists that are able to move around on their own. So the ones that you might see if you look at pond water under a microscope, they can move around, and it's often the cytoskeleton that helps them move. So in this picture, the cytoskeleton is the green stringy parts. Okay, then we have a set of organelles that build and ship proteins. So building and shipping proteins is a really important function. So there's several organelles that work together to do this. They are ribosomes, rough endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus. So kind of crazy names here. Ribosomes are little tiny organelles, and they use the code of DNA to manufacture amino acid chains that make up proteins. Rough endoplasmic reticulum folds those proteins into the correct shape and then places them in a vesicle. Remember, vesicles are the little shipping containers, and they're made of the same stuff as cell membranes. And then the third one, the Golgi apparatus, puts the finishing touches on these proteins and repackages them into new vesicles and ships them into the correct place. Sometimes that might be out of the cell, or that might be somewhere else inside of the cell. So these three are really important in making proteins. There's also smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which has a very similar structure to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but a different function. It has groups of enzymes that are there to do special tasks. So the smooth endoplasmic reticulum makes the membrane lipids that make up cell membranes and makes up the vesicles and vacuoles. And they also have some enzymes that get rid of toxins. So organs like your liver have cells that are going to be full of lots and lots of smooth endoplasmic reticulum because that's the job, is to get rid of toxins. We've got chloroplasts. These are organelles that are only found in plant cells and some protists. They use photosynthesis to store energy from the sun, and they have their own DNA that's separate from the DNA of the rest of the cell. So that's pretty cool. And very similar, but they do the opposite function is mitochondria. Mitochondria break down sugar to release energy that the cell can use. Mitochondria also have their own DNA, separate from the rest of the cell's DNA. And we've been talking about things that are generally common to both types of cells, both animal and plant cells. Um, but there's a few differences. Plant cells have cell walls and chloroplasts, so they can do photosynthesis, and they have a large vacuole in the center that stores water. And animal cells don't really have any of those. The only organelle that animal cells have that plants don't is something called centrioles, which help in cell division. And if you need to know any of that, there is a handy chart. It's on page 175. This chart lists the function of all the organelles, and it shows which are in animal cells and which are in plant cells, and how they compare in eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So any question about cell organelles, about what's present in each cell, about differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, definitely check out page 175 because it has a lot of that information all in one place. Okay, and to review this section, section 2, we have 2 more questions, so I'm going to bring up a poll here. There we go. So which organelle is not involved in making and moving proteins? So again, we do need anyone present to answer the poll. Your options are ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, and lysosomes. So 3 of those are involved in making proteins and 1 is not. Which one is not? Okay, I think my sound went out for a while there, so I hope you heard most of the other slide. This one is, which of the following do plant cells have but animal cells do not? Nucleus, cytoskeleton, cell walls, centrioles, or chloroplasts? There are more than one answer to this one. So plant cells have cell walls, centrioles, and chloroplasts. Wait, oh, I said that wrong. I'm sorry. Plant cells have cell walls and chloroplasts. Animal cells do not have either of those. And then I accidentally said centrioles. That's not right. This one only animal cells have, but plant cells do not. And then both of them have the first two, nucleus and a cytoskeleton. All right, section 3 on cell transport. So this section is about how things get across cell membranes. So you may be thinking, don't cell membranes keep things out? I thought that was their purpose. Well, it's their purpose to regulate what gets across. The cell does need to get resources from outside and send things from the inside to the outside, but it also needs the membrane to just keep that from happening with no control at all. So some small molecules that are nonpolar, they can kind of slip right through the bilayer in between the lipids, but that's pretty limited. So most other molecules, they have to pass through protein channels. So again, there are just these proteins that go all the way across the cells. So some of them basically are just channels that molecules could go through to get from one side to the other. There's some special ones called aquaporins that let water go through. And there's two categories for moving things across the cell membranes. In passive transport, stuff crosses the membrane without requiring any energy to be used. And then active transport, energy is required. So let's look at both of those. Diffusion is a type of passive transport. Diffusion is simply molecules spreading out. So you can think of it like people at a party. They may all start in one room. Maybe people come in the door and they hang out in the kitchen. Um, sorry, the may all start in one room, but as more guests come in and it gets crowded, the people will naturally spread out of there into other rooms. So it's basically just what's happening with diffusion. This is what's happening across membranes. If one type of molecule is crowded in the cell but not in the environment outside, they will diffuse out of the cell. And if the environment has a high concentration outside, but there's a lower concentration inside, like you see on the screen, the molecules will diffuse into the cell. Okay? And here's the animation for the other way. If you have a high concentration inside, and there's not really any outside, they'll diffuse out of the cell. Another type of passive transport is osmosis. So when solid molecules can't move all across a membrane, the concentrations can still be evened out by moving the water instead of the dissolved stuff. So in this cell on the screen, there's a high concentration inside, but a low concentration outside. So those molecules can't move, but the water can move into the cell. And this is going to make the cell bigger and decrease the concentration of the solute inside of the cell. So there's still the same number of molecules dissolved inside the cell, but they have more water to spread out in. And there are three different situations for osmosis, so we'll look at all three of them. First, if the concentrations inside the cell and out of the cell are equal. In this case, there is no noticeable movement of water. It just sort of drifts in and out in both directions equally, and the cell is not changed by this. This is called an isotonic solution. The cell could also be in a solution where there is a higher concentration of solute outside the cell than inside of it. In this case, the water will leave the cell to increase the concentration inside and decrease the concentration outside. So the cell will sort of shrivel like you see on the screen. It's the water has left it and it's kind of collapsed. This is called a hypertonic solution. And in the third situation, there's a lower concentration of solute outside the cell than inside. So the water will move into the cell, decreasing the concentration on the outside. This makes the cell bigger and stretched out and can sometimes stretch a cell until it bursts. And that was called a hypotonic solution. So be careful, these words are pretty similar. Hypertonic means there's a higher concentration outside of the cell, and hypotonic means there's a lower concentration outside of the cell. And remember, facilitated diffusion and osmosis, those are examples of passive transport that does not require energy to happen. They are ways of going with the flow. The cells naturally try to even out the concentrations. In order to move molecules into an area that already has a high concentration, the cell must spend energy. It also needed for molecules that are too big to fit through the membrane channels. There has to be a method of getting them through, and that's also going to use energy. Using energy to move molecules is called active transport. In active transport, special proteins can act as pumps to move the molecules. So in this example, the pumps are using energy to move blue dots into the cell. So one goes into this protein pump, and then it shows it here in the middle, and then is going from the pump to the inside of the cell. Even though there's already a high concentration of those blue dots in the cell. And for things that are just too big to get through the cell membrane, there are types of active transport called endocytosis and exocytosis. So in endocytosis, the membrane creates a pocket that surrounds some materials, and then it breaks off inside of the cell, and it moves into the cell, taking the materials with it. And the reverse of that is exocytosis. So it's the cell having a vesicle inside, which binds onto the cell membrane, and the cell kind of spits it out. So review questions for this one. If there is a high concentration of a solute outside of a cell and a low concentration inside, what will the water do? And we're going to assume the solute can't move in this case, only the water. So high concentration outside and a low concentration inside. So will the water from the outside of the cell move to the inside of the cell? Will water move from the inside of the cell to the outside? Or will it just sort of drift in and out equally in both directions? Well, if we have a high concentration of solute, now solute again is the dissolved stuff, the molecules. If there's a high concentration of solute outside of the cell and a low concentration inside, that means the cell is going to want to get rid of some water inside while keeping all the molecules. It's going to increase the concentration inside. So it's going to move from, wait, Sorry, the box is in the wrong place. Okay, so there we go. It's going to move from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. So the water moves out, and that's going to make the cell shrink and decrease the concentration or increase the concentration inside of the cell so that it sort of evens out with what's outside. Next one, which of these use energy to transport substances? Diffusion, osmosis, protein pumps, endocytosis, or exocytosis. So for energy, we only want the active transport. So the first two are passive transport, but the pumps and the endocytosis and the exocytosis, those all require energy. Those are all active transport. And our last section in this chapter is about homeostasis. So homeostasis is a word that means keeping everything the same. So a single-celled organism, remember bacteria, some protists that swim around in pond water, they have to do it all with one cell. That cell has to respond to the environment, change food into energy, grow and reproduce. So one cell is just maintaining its own homeostasis. Inside of a bigger organism's body, you have different types of cells playing different roles in maintaining homeostasis. For example, you need to stay at the correct temperature, so your body has processes that keep it around 98 degrees, whether the environment around you is hotter or colder. So in that case, you have different cells that are going to be specialized to help with making that happen. So how do cells help maintain the homeostasis? Well, each type of cell has a different job. This is called specialization. For example, muscle cells contract, stomach cells make acid, liver cells break down toxins. They all play a part in keeping homeostasis. Another example over here, there's different kinds of white blood cells, so they all are specialized in doing a different function in your blood, keeping your body in the condition that it needs to be in. So how do they do this? Cells can send chemicals to other cells, and these chemicals signal a cell to tell it what to do. If the body needs more of a substance to maintain homeostasis, some cells will send that signal to other cells, and the cells that receive the signal may be able to produce more of what the body needs. Cells can also send chemical signals to neighboring cells so that they all work together to do something. For example, the picture on your screen is heart cells, and all the cells in your heart need to contract at the same time for the heart to work. So they communicate with nerves and communicate with each other in order to do this. And complex bodies are organized into different levels of organization. So you have individual cells, and they can be specialized to do something special. And your specialized cells in a group together make tissues. The tissues have jobs to do, and different tissues actually work together in organs. And their different organs make up organ systems. And the example here, you've got a little stomach cell that's making up the tissue that is the stomach lining for this mouse, which is part of the organ of the stomach. And then this diagram shows that, that stomach organ is part of the entire digestive system, the whole organ system. And our last set of review questions. So a single-celled organism has to do all of the following to maintain homeostasis, except what? So a single cell, one cell living by itself, one bacteria or one little paramecium floating around in pond water, has to do all of these except send signals to other cells, respond to the environment surrounding it, or turn food into energy to fuel its functions. So the only one it doesn't really have to do is send signals to other cells because it is one entire organism all by itself. It does still need to respond to the environment around it, and it needs to get energy from its food to fuel its functions. And our last review question here: which of these are correctly arranged from least complex to most complex? So this is the levels of organization we just talked about. Okay, they're all just rearranged. So from the least complex is going to be cell, and then cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, and organs make up organ systems. And then if you put a whole bunch of organ systems together, you get a complex organism. Okay, so that's it for chapter 7. Hopefully that helped clear up some things about cells. If you have any more questions and you're watching this later, here's ways that you can contact your instructor.